What if I told you that at the dawn of the 20th century, America fought a war that killed more civilians than the Vietnam War? A war where children as young as 10 were deliberately targeted, where villages were wiped off the map, and where torture was not an exception but routine policy. And what if I told you that this war, the Filipino-American War, has been so carefully buried in our collective memory that most Americans never hear about it at all? We all grew up with certain stories about America: the Revolution, where freedom was won against empire; the Civil War, where slavery was ended; World War II, where fascism was defeated. These stories tell us America always stood on the side of liberty. But the Filipino-American War tells a different story, one in which America itself acted as an empire, claiming territory, crushing resistance, and justifying it all under the language of civilization and destiny. So the question we have to ask tonight is simple. Why was this story hidden? Why is this brutal conflict, with all its atrocities, largely erased from our history books? Is it because it contradicts the image of America as the perpetual liberator? Or is it because remembering it would force us to see ourselves in a way we'd rather not? Let's uncover the history we were never taught and explore the war America tried to forget. To understand how this war began, we need to go back to 1898, when the United States declared war on Spain. It was painted as a noble war, fought to free Cuba from Spanish tyranny, and the press called it a splendid little war because it lasted only a few months and resulted in a decisive U.S. victory. But beyond the headlines was the Philippines, a Spanish colony thousands of miles away in the Pacific. For decades, Filipinos had been struggling against Spanish rule, and by the time the United States entered the war, they were already close to independence. A young revolutionary leader, Emilio Aguinaldo, had rallied thousands of fighters, declared a republic, and believed the United States would be a partner in freedom. After all, America itself had once thrown off the yoke of empire. When U.S. forces sailed into Manila Bay and destroyed the Spanish fleet, Filipinos fought alongside them, capturing towns, pushing back Spanish garrisons, and believing that independence was near. Aguinaldo himself spoke of America as a friend and liberator, and American officers treated him as an ally, at least until the war with Spain ended. Because when the Treaty of Paris was signed in December of 1898, Spain agreed to sell the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. Think about that for a moment. A nation of 7 million people who had declared themselves free were bought and sold on a piece of paper in Paris. No Filipino representatives were present. No Filipino voices were heard. Their independence, which they believed was imminent, was erased by a transaction between two foreign powers. Aguinaldo and his followers were outraged. They had written a constitution, raised their flag, and declared sovereignty. Now they were told they were not a republic, not even allies, but subjects of a new occupier. To the American public, the Philippines was described as a duty and a burden. To U.S. leaders, it was a strategic prize, a gateway to Asia, a stepping stone to trade with China, and a symbol of America's arrival on the global stage. To Filipinos, it was a betrayal, an exchange of one empire for another, and from that betrayal, war was inevitable. In the tense months that followed, American and Filipino forces lived side by side around Manila, watching one another, mistrust growing by the day. Filipinos demanded recognition of their republic. Americans dismissed them as rebels. Every night, Armed patrols circled the city, and every day negotiations failed. On February 4th, 1899, the fragile balance shattered. A U.S. sentry fired on a Filipino soldier who had crossed into contested territory. That single gunshot set off hours of firefights that spread through Manila like wildfire. By the morning, full-scale war had begun. Aguinaldo called on his people to resist, and tens of thousands of Filipinos rose to fight. At first, they fought in the open, in organized formations, against American troops who were better armed, better trained, and supported by naval power. For months, battles raged across Luzon, the largest island, as Filipinos tried desperately to defend their republic. But the U.S. had more men, more guns, and more money. By late 1899, Filipino forces had been driven into the mountains. Aguinaldo himself was forced to flee, his government scattered. On paper, the United States had won. But in reality, the war was only beginning, because the Filipinos did not surrender. They adapted. Abandoning open battle, they turned to guerrilla tactics, ambushes, sabotage, blending with civilians, and using the terrain to strike at American patrols. The United States, expecting a quick, clean war, now found itself in a brutal, endless struggle where the enemy was invisible and the line between civilian and soldier blurred. This is when the war turned darker, when frustration gave way to cruelty, and when atrocities multiplied. When faced with guerrilla war, the U.S. military chose to respond with overwhelming brutality. Soldiers burned entire villages suspected of aiding rebels, leaving smoldering ruins where homes once stood. Civilians were herded into reconcentration zones, fenced camps designed to separate the people from the fighters. But in reality, they became death traps, where disease and hunger killed thousands. Anyone caught outside the camps could be shot on sight. Torture became routine. The most infamous method was the water cure, where prisoners were forced to drink gallons of water until their stomachs distended painfully, and then soldiers would jump on them, beat them, or force more water down until they passed out or begged for death. One general, Jacob Smith, issued orders on the island of Samar that anyone over the age of 10 was to be killed, turning a province into what he proudly called a howling wilderness. Imagine that. Children as young as 10, treated as enemies. American soldiers, many of them volunteers from the Midwest and South, wrote home about the horrors they saw and committed, some expressing guilt, others boasting. Newspapers occasionally reported atrocities, but most downplayed them as exaggerations or justified them as necessary against savages. By 1902, estimates suggest between 200,000 and 300,000 Filipinos were dead, the majority civilians. Compare that to just over 4,000 American soldiers. This wasn't a war between equals. It was a colonial war, a war of conquest, and its brutality rivaled anything carried out by the European empires America claimed to be better than. Yet for over a century, this truth was softened, hidden, or erased. Back in the United States, however, not everyone was blind to the truth. As reports of atrocities filtered back, a movement rose against the war. It was called the Anti-Imperialist League, and it included some of the most famous Americans of the era. Andrew Carnegie, who offered to pay the $20 million himself just to free the Philippines. Former President Grover Cleveland, who warned that empire would corrupt America. And most famously, Mark Twain, whose scathing essays tore into the hypocrisy of the war. Twain wrote that America's flag, once a symbol of liberty, now should be painted with skulls, and crossbones. He mocked the language of civilizing missions, pointing out that burning villages, torturing prisoners, and slaughtering children was not civilization, but barbarism. Across the country, debates raged. Some argued that America had a duty to bring order, Christianity, and modernity to the Philippines. Others said the war betrayed America's founding ideals, turning a republic into an empire. But the voices of dissent were drowned out by nationalism and propaganda. Newspapers portrayed Filipinos as uncivilized, incapable of governing themselves, and prone to chaos without American guidance. The government painted the war as a mission of uplift and duty, and the public, still intoxicated by the victory over Spain, largely accepted it. Yet the Anti-Imperialist League left behind a legacy, proof that even at the height of empire, there were Americans willing to call it by its name, conquest. By 1902, Aguinaldo had been captured, forced to swear allegiance to the United States, and President Theodore Roosevelt declared the war officially over. But the reality was different. Fighting continued for years, especially in the southern islands, where Muslim Filipinos resisted American control well into the 1910s. American governors built roads, schools, and institutions, but always under the shadow of a conquest that had begun in blood. The Philippines would remain under U.S. rule until 1946, when independence was finally recognized after World War II. But by then, the scars of war were deep. Generations grew up under colonial rule, their independence delayed nearly half a century. In the United States, the war quickly faded from memory. Why? Perhaps because it didn't fit the story America wanted to tell about itself. School books preferred the Revolution, the Civil War, and World War II, wars where America stood on the side of liberty. But this was different. This was a war of conquest, fought to deny liberty to people who had already declared themselves free. Remembering it would mean admitting that the United States, too, had acted like the empires it condemned. So the war was tucked away in footnotes, overshadowed by larger conflicts, and left out of popular history. Only in recent decades have historians begun to dig deeper, piecing together letters, diaries, and reports to reconstruct the full horror of what happened. And the more we learn, the clearer it becomes. The Filipino-American War was not a minor skirmish, but one of the most brutal and consequential wars of its time. So why does this matter today? Why should we remember a war fought more than a century ago in a country thousands of miles away? Because the Filipino-American War forces us to confront the reality of American history, not as we wish it to be, but as it was. It reminds us that America's rise as a world power was not just about ideals of freedom and democracy, but also about conquest and empire. It shows us that myths of civilization and uplift were often masks for domination. And it teaches us that forgetting is itself a political act, a choice made to preserve a certain story about who we are. If we erase wars like this, we erase the voices of those who suffered and those who resisted. We erase the truth that America has not always lived up to its ideals, and by forgetting, we risk repeating those same mistakes in different forms. The Filipino-American War was not just a war of the past. It is a mirror, reflecting uncomfortable truths about power, violence, and memory. So what did you think about today's video? Was this a part of history you had ever heard before? Comment your thoughts and your suggestions for the next episode below. And together, let's keep uncovering the hidden truths of American history.